Hi, I wanted to talk about T.S. Eliot, Thomas Stearns Eliot, who is an American, but he kind of switched sides, went across the Atlantic, became British. Um, and so chances are pretty good if you take an American lit, you've also read T.S. Eliot. Both sides want to claim him, and for good reason, because he's, one of the, if not the most important poet writing in English in the 20th century. I mean, that's arguable, of course. But there's no argument that he is truly important and definitely one of the most influential. Now, T.S. Eliot, I would argue, brings us about 180 degrees from where we were with William Wordsworth. Okay, so Wordsworth over here, T.S. Eliot way over there, right? Just, not even close to each other. Just a step back to the beginning of the semester when we were talking about Romanticism. Remember, Romanticism was talking about the real language of men, the expressive power of poetry, in other words, to express the feelings of the poet, to convey to the reader the emotions and experiences, powerful experiences that the poet has or has had, right? And convey that in the real language of men. With T.S. Eliot, we have a very impersonal writer, right? We don't get much of T.S. Eliot himself and his personal experiences. He's not interested in doing that. Real language of men? Are you kidding me? And I'm not just talking about vocabulary. I'm talking about the incredible wealth of allusions, references to works, other works, and not just commonly known works like, say, William Shakespeare, but also to arcane, esoteric works that require footnotes. And not even just for us, even in T.S. Eliot's own writing, he actually inserted footnotes on occasion to some of his poetry so that people would have at least a bit of a help in terms of understanding what he said. So what is the point of all this, right? Well, the point is the time, right? The modernist era, the early 20th century, industrialization, war, nationalism, loss of religion. And probably the most important word we could use, alienation. We are separated from what came before, our traditions, the things that tended to ground people. We saw a little tiny echo of this, or not echo is probably not the right word, a spark of this in Dover Beach by Matthew Arnold, right? The notion that this contemporary world, right, think Thomas Hardy and his, he called it ameliorism. Other people might more realistically call it pessimism. As life proceeds into the 20th century, the individual is lost. The individual is lost. And we see this very clearly in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Now, I recognize the difficulty of T.S. Eliot. We have two poems, this one and The Wasteland. And I think you'll agree, I think everyone will agree, Prufrock is more accessible than The Wasteland, if for no other reason than it's a lot shorter, a little easier to handle. The references are not too obscure. There is, of course, the prefatory lines, which I assume that you read in your medieval Italian, which we all, of course, learned in elementary school, right? Good thing for footnotes, right? But that medieval Italian preface is from Dante, Dante's Inferno. And the sum of what's being said is, because if you understand the story of the Inferno, right? Dante and Virgil, the Roman poet, is leading Dante through hell. And he sees all kinds of people. A lot of them are real people from his history and even in his own contemporary world. in hell. And he comes up to a person who says that he can tell him the truth, that this person can speak the truth to Dante because he knows he'll never go back to the land of the living. So we have this promise of transparency, honesty, truthfulness. We're going to get that part that you wouldn't tell anybody, even your best friend, your spouse, your parent, your child, especially not your child. You are going to be honest in a way that, heck, you are not even with your therapist honest. And that's where we get into the mind of J. Alfred Prufrock. Now, Prufrock has a lot of allusions, many of them Shakespearean, but a lot of other ones as well, right? You have to read it carefully. And, my advice typically in encountering Eliot is to read first of all and try to resist the temptation to read the footnotes. Just read it once without going through the footnotes. It's not that long. See what you can get just without any editorial help. Then go back and read with the footnotes and reread and so on as often as you can. But Prufrock is the 20th century man. At least as T.S. Eliot envisions that 20th century man. The person who is so self-aware that they're paralyzed. What is that expression? Analysis, paralysis through analysis. I mean, I hate that. A lot of cliches like that. But what he's analyzing is himself. And because he's analyzing himself so much, he cannot act. He cannot move. He cannot change his life, even if it's something that would be very, very positive. Because there's that big fat if standing in the way, because maybe it won't. Right? You examine it from this angle, examine it from that angle. There are references to Hamlet. And if you're not familiar with the play Hamlet, let me talk about a character from Hamlet, because I think it's really important in this poem. And in the editorial notes, Greenblatt and his fellow editors actually don't really dig into it very well, I don't think. Hamlet, of course, is the main character of Hamlet. But there is a minor character named Polonius, and minor but important. Polonius is the father of Ophelia, Hamlet's love interest or girlfriend, if you want to call her that. He is also an advisor to the king. Now, the king is Hamlet's uncle. And I'm sure you know this, even if you've never read Hamlet. The story of Hamlet is that Hamlet's father has been murdered, and the crown has passed from the father to the brother. He doesn't trust the brother. He doesn't trust his mother. He doesn't really trust anybody. And he certainly doesn't trust Polonius. But Polonius is a talker. Okay? Yap, 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 yap. It's kind of part of the, I wouldn't call it the humor, well, kind of a little bit of humor of the play. And he is a schemer, Polonius, although a bit of a incompetent one, right? And Polonius, I'm sorry to be a bit of a spoiler, but I do have to make this comment. Polonius is the first to die, because Hamlet kills Polonius by accident, thinking when Polonius is hiding behind a drape or a curtain, trying to listen in to a conversation, and Hamlet realizes somebody is back there, he thinks it's the king, his uncle, and stabs him. Only Polonius falls out instead of Claudius. This causes problems with his girlfriend, of course, as many other problems as well. Prufrock sees himself as Polonius, not Hamlet. He's not the hero, nor was meant to be. Okay? And that's something I want you to really think about as you look at it. The second piece is called The Wasteland, which is an enormously powerful and difficult piece. Again, if you can, read it without footnotes first time through. I recommend, by the way, because I have posted a recording of T.S. Eliot himself doing the reading of The Wasteland. And what I would do if I were you is I would play that recording with the book open in front of me and read along as you listen to T.S. Eliot speak. The poem is written in about 6 different languages. It's helpful to have footnotes for that. And there are numerous more footnotes. But listen to it the first time if you can, and just read without footnotes. Then go back again and read, this time maybe engaging the footnotes, and then you can engage, because there are some pages in this poem that are actually more footnote than poem. Right? It's a complex poem. But I'll give you an overview, basically. It concerns the myth of the Fisher King. The idea of the Fisher King is like a fertility god, right? A vegetable god. You have to kill the god to get life. So you kill the god, you bury the god, and 3 months later, or 3 days later, the god rises back up and new life begins. Sound familiar? It should, right? The story of Jesus and the resurrection at Easter is another story of a similar nature. But here we have a story where the vegetable god, the fertility god, has not risen back up. It has not come again. There is no spring. April is the cruelest month, because we remember April and the beauty of April as spring comes. And now there is no spring. Now there are so many layers and so many things that you could say about this poem. Every time I teach this poem in the classroom, when I actually get a chance to interact directly with students, and I know that I personally see something new and different every single time. And I don't know how many times I've read this poem. I do not know how many times I've taught this poem or heard this poem in the T.S. Eliot recording. It's been a lot. And yet every single time I get something new out of it. That's how dense this poem is. That's one of the humongous advantages that the modernist writers employed in bringing in allusions and references to multiple works and sources, different traditions, both Eastern and Western, the obvious and well-known like Shakespeare, and the less obvious, well-known like read the footnotes, right? This is a metaphor for our society, or particularly in the 20th century, as T.S. Eliot saw it. A decay, a loss of spirituality, loss of meaning, loss of purpose. And in place, we have our distractions like sex and booze and, well, they didn't do a lot of drugs then, but you can add that to the ball game now. Any entertainment, right? So that we don't think, right? T.S. Eliot is urging us to think. Think about our world. Think about purpose. Think about meaning. And he sees the West, the Western civilization, as having lost that. But I'll give you this one little clue, this one little help. He looks to the East. This is not uncommon. Like, think of the Beatles, George Harrison going to India. Right? We go to the East because they have not lost their spirituality in the East.